Well, 2 more Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in fighting with pro-Russia forces. Now, Kiev says 20 soldiers were also wounded in the clashes in the mostly Russian-speaking Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine. The deaths bring to 6 the number of Ukrainian troops killed since Thursday evening. The pro-Russian forces want independence from Ukraine, but Kiev has rejected their demand. Fighting between the two sides has claimed 4,700 lives. The Ukrainian crisis has caused tension between Russia and the West, which has sided with the government in Kiev. Well, let's cross over to Washington, joined by former U.S. Senate foreign policy analyst, Mr. James Jontris. Thank you so much for being with us. It just seems that this situation in eastern Ukraine does not get any better. In your perspective, what has to happen right now? Technically, there's a ceasefire in place. However, we continue to see people die.
Well, we don't know whether this latest flare-up is anything different from what we've seen since the ceasefire went into effect in September. It has not been a perfect ceasefire. There have been sporadic violations, both sides accusing the other of violating the ceasefire. We know there's supposed to be a meeting coming up in Kazakhstan on January 15th. We don't know yet if that will take place. What I think we're seeing is this conflict is settling into a kind of a festering, frozen conflict with no particular resolution in sight. In the meantime, yesterday, Mr. Siluanov, the Russian finance minister, declared that Ukraine was in violation of the terms of a $3 billion loan from Moscow, which was in a position to call for its immediate payment. They have not yet decided whether to do that, but if they did, that would likely push Ukraine into default. So things are getting very, very precarious on Kiev's side. Meanwhile, there is no resolution to the eastern conflict.
Let's look at another aspect to this crisis, and that's relations between Washington and Moscow. How do you see this actually playing itself out in the months to come? We've entered a new year, but it seems like the same old policy is in place.
I don't think anybody knows. It could get a lot more dangerous if it doesn't get resolved. Frankly, Washington has been relatively quiet over the last few weeks. I don't know whether that's because of their focus on Iraq and Syria or because of the situation in France. There also have been signs that more European voices are really tired of this policy of sanctions against Russia as the only solution to the Ukraine conflict, which clearly is not working. So I think there's an indication that there's some distance now between Washington and Europe and among the European countries. And I think in that context, maybe it's a little hard for Washington to push its support for the Kiev side of this conflict as hard as they were doing several months ago.
You've brought up an interesting point. That's the sanction options. And of course, the Europeans are also becoming more and more affected, and they do not want the sanctions to be increased or to be continued. If, as you say, there is possibly a drift between the Europeans and the United States, is it possible then that this situation can become resolved easier? Is it if the two allies, as far as the Europeans and the United States, are no longer on the same page, is it easier to resolve this crisis or not?
Yes, I think it is. Frankly, from a Russian point of view, what the Americans do or don't do, what we do, doesn't really make that much difference, except for out-and-out financial warfare with regard to the dollar and currency exchange, which frankly is very dangerous for the American side as well. Much more important, however, are the role of the European economies and their trade with Russia, and that's a two-edged sword. We see Europe already inching toward another recession, frankly, in another recession, and the last thing they need is a prolonged trade war with Russia. So certainly there are a lot of people in Europe who would like to see this resolved.
All right, thank you so much for being with us out of Washington. Former U.S. Senate foreign policy analyst, Mr. James Jontris.